So we're basically, I like to chunk things into three categories, even though these three tend to feed off each other quite frequently and appear in conjunction quite frequently. Neurotransmitter imbalances, leaky brain, and that this is also often referred to, of course, as a leaky blood-brain barrier, which is not always bad. If you need to deliver, say, drugs or supplements or nootropics or pharmaceuticals to the brain, sometimes you actually do want to induce a temporary state of leakage in order for that to occur. This is often how they also induce neurotoxicity in rodent models in the lab. But in most cases, blood-brain barrier leakage is a bad thing. Dysfunction of the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, is the third way that things can kind of go south as far as the brain is concerned. So we're going to tackle each of these one by one, with the first being neurotransmitters, the chemical messengers of the brain. They're not rocket science to understand. They are simply transmitting signals between nerve cells. So the image you're seeing right now depicts the process called synaptic transmission. You already learned about that in your lesson prep, and in basic terms, your brain is communicating with the rest of your body by initiating a chain reaction that runs along this string of neurons called nerve cells, and each neuron has dendrites at its head where it receives messages and axons at the other end where it transmits messages. So a neuron relays the message from the dendrite to the action through this thing called an action potential, which is essentially a state of charge imbalance. So neurotransmitters transport those signals across that cleft, that synaptic cleft, which is the gap between those two neurons that you see, the axon and the dendrite. And then ideally, the action potential, should the neurotransmitters be released in sufficient quantities and those receptor sites be available, the message gets delivered, whether that's to stop eating or to focus on a task or to keep pedaling or to keep running or to keep lifting. Now, unfortunately, many people walk around with some sort of suboptimal nerve communication, and that can lead to neurotransmitter deficiencies and imbalances and a host of other issues like brain fog and anxiety and trouble sleeping and mood disorders. So what I want to look at now are a few ways that can actually happen and what you can do about it. So in your lesson prep, you learned about the different neurotransmitters and their main function on the body. And the interesting thing is, depending on your individual genetics and your environment and your lifestyle, you can be prone to the dominance or the depletion of a specific neurotransmitter. That can affect the signaling in your brain, your actions, your personality. So let's take serotonin, for example. People who are prone to serotonin dominance, they tend to be highly responsive to sensory input like sounds and light and social interaction. They tend to get burnt out sometimes a little bit if they spend too much time in those situations, but they also tend to thrive a bit on excitement and change and novelty. But in excess, that serotonin can cause nervousness or distraction. So people with excess serotonin, they often get very angry, very sad, kind of display some symptoms of bipolar, depression, other mood disorders. But then you get serotonin deficiency on the other end of things, and that often shows up in being unable to fall asleep or feeling tired but wired, or unable to get restful sleep. And so, anything in a serotonin excess or a serotonin deficiency state that would help to modulate serotonin levels can assist one in that type of scenario. We'll talk a little bit more about those, but for example, we have a St. John's wort that grows outside of our house on our property, and we recently took a whole bunch of St. John's wort flowers and leaves and ground them up in the blender and left them in vodka for 4 weeks. You then strain that through the vodka and you make a little tincture, and it's essentially helping to replace deficient serotonin and dopamine levels. So that's something that my family and I can use, for example, in the winter when we're getting less sunshine exposure and our neurotransmitters are going to be a little bit lower. So this would be something you would use as a way to address serotonin, because St. John's wort would act as a serotonin, almost like an SSRI, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, and allow for more serotonin to be available. Another example would be acetylcholine. So I actually personally, when I've taken the quiz, which you've already been given a link to in the prep for this lesson, and which I'll allude to again here in a second, a good questionnaire that you can take. I have acetylcholine dominance. So that's correlated with highly creative people, people who are highly judgmental or perfectionist, social, adventurous tendencies. A lot of acetylcholine, it can cause paranoia, it can cause anxiety. Not enough results in memory loss and slow and foggy thinking. But since I personally know that I'm acetylcholine dominant, or if you test a client or a patient and can recognize their specific neurotransmitter imbalance, even in the absence of something like genetic testing or something like, let's say, a strategy analysis, which can indeed identify some of these neurotransmitters as well, you can take action steps to mitigate those issues. So the way that you would do this in a traditional medical setting, a doc could test your neurotransmitters by looking at blood or cerebrospinal fluid or urine. And a urinary neurotransmitter test is right now probably the most popular. But the problem is that doesn't necessarily measure levels in the brain. And there's been no study that has ever correlated the neurotransmitter levels in the brain and the rest of the body. So neurotransmitter levels that are created elsewhere in your body can stay outside your brain. So you might get a urinary neurotransmitter test and it really doesn't show what's happening because the blood-brain barrier, your brain's selective filter, you'll learn about later in this lesson, is keeping neurotransmitters from spilling over into the rest of the body, which would be disruptive because you actually need many of them localized to brain tissue. Now, this is important because the rest of your body can produce a significant number of neurotransmitters, particularly those little invaders in your gut, your microbiome, right? The bacteria, those can synthesize about 95% of the serotonin that you create and over 30 other different neurotransmitters. So your neurotransmitter levels are constantly changing based on probiotics, on fermented foods, on environmental microbiome. That has a significant impact on these. But in terms of how they're going to interact specifically with personality, mood disorders, cravings, sleep, etc., it's the ones in the brain that we primarily care about, or the way that the ones in the brain are actually manifesting themselves. And this is where